Welcome to the history section.
The initial call for the First Crusade set off an extraordinary reaction, one that was immediate, overwhelming, and almost catastrophically disorganized.
Right. And today we are exploring those initial waves of the movement. Specifically, we're focusing on the distinction between the vast, unmanaged multitude that set out first.
The so-called People's Crusade.
Exactly. And the later, much more disciplined princely armies. The original logistical plan, the one outlined by the princes, was actually quite sound.
It was. Recognizing that the sheer number of Christians taking the cross was massive, they agreed to set out at different times.
And to converge at Constantinople.
A very sensible measure. It was intended to prevent the total exhaustion of resources and, supply lines along their continental routes.
But that sensible military planning, it almost immediately ran into a wall of popular impatience.
And just raw religious fervor. This initial force, impatient to begin the holy endeavor, coalesced around a charismatic, if completely unprepared leader.
Peter the Hermit.
Peter the Hermit, yes. A Cenobite, a solitary hermit priest who had been central to the initial preaching. Peter, based on what history tells us, seemed genuinely convinced that divine enthusiasm and zealotry were sufficient substitutes for military discipline.
Or for logistics.
Or for logistics, absolutely.
And the force he managed to amass was truly staggering. It was a chaotic migration, estimated at somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 individuals.
This was not a military formation.
Not at all. It was a desperate, mobile population. It was dragging along women, children, the elderly, the sick.
It was a pilgrimage, really, but one undertaken with the intent to fight a war on the far side of the continent.
The defining characteristic of this multitude seems to have been the level of blind, almost naive faith.
Completely. They set out convinced they were divinely called, genuinely hoping for miracles.
They expected rivers to open before them, right? Echoing the biblical Exodus.
And for manna to fall from heaven to sustain them on their journey. This absolute reliance on supernatural intervention, rather than the practicalities of supply and strategy, sealed their fate almost before they even left the European heartland.
And the precarious nature of their leadership was visible from the very beginning. Peter's army split early on, and the vanguard was led by a man whose legacy is defined entirely by his circumstances.
Walter the Penniless.
Walter the Penniless. His very surname, which is preserved in the historical records, attests to the utter lack of funding for this operation.
It's incredible. This vanguard consisted of only 8 horsemen.
Just 8. Every other person was marching on foot, relying entirely on the fickle fortunes of charity for subsistence.
And that reliance on charity, it dictated their movements and their initial reception. As long as they remained in French territory and among populations along the Rhine who were sympathetic to the cause, they were treated as the people of God.
And provisions flowed freely. They met no real enemies there.
The problems only really began once they moved into territories where the locals did not share their fervor.
This is where the cultural and political friction starts, specifically when they encountered the Hungarians and the Bulgarians, who had no investment in Western European religious ideology.
The initial plan to travel through the Balkans just assumed cooperation, but the reality was immediate hostility.
To really understand that resistance, you have to look at the history of these regions.
You do. The Hungarians, originating from Tartary, shared a distant common ancestry with the Turks. By the 11th century, they had embraced Christianity and were organized under a king. But their geographic and political priorities were internal.
So they were just indifferent to the fever of the crusade.
Indifferent and certainly unwilling to host and provision. An undisciplined army of 100,000 people moving through their lands.
And the Bulgarians were an even more distinct problem.
Yes. Descended from the slaves, they had a centuries-long, deeply antagonistic relationship with the Byzantine Empire. It was characterized by periods where they were alternately vassals and savage invaders.
The research has this astonishing detail that they had once killed the Byzantine emperor Nicephorus and used his skull, encased in gold, as a cup for their chieftains.
Using an emperor's skull as a trophy cup. That single detail highlights the terrifying cultural and political gulf between the Western Crusaders' expectations of civilized travel and the volatile reality of the Balkan lands they were crossing.
Walter's vanguard encountered these dangers first. In Hungary, Walter initially managed to maintain a precarious peace.
He demonstrated a degree of prudence, yes, by enduring insults and avoiding provocation.
But as they entered Bulgaria, the extreme misery and lack of provisions became a critical issue,
And discipline broke down completely. They began stealing flocks, burning houses, and massacring inhabitants who dared to resist their violence.
which provoked the inevitable and violent retaliation.
Irritated Bulgarians attacked Walter's soldiers, who were slowed and burdened by their ill-gotten booty. The research notes a tragic incident where 140 crusaders perished after seeking refuge in a church.
Which the Bulgarians then set ablaze.
Exactly.
Walter continued on, leading the meager remnants of his army, and arrived at the gates of Nicea as a supplicant.
And the governor, seeing the sheer display of misery, offered aid, provisions, arms, and clothing. Walter's remaining forces passed through Thrace without further disorders, eventually reaching the walls of Constantinople after 2 months of exhausting travel.
Where Emperor Alexius I permitted them to wait, likely out of a mixture of pity and strategic concern.
Walter's miserable passage was mild compared to what followed with Peter the Hermit's main column. Peter's army lacked even the moderation Walter briefly exhibited and was far less disciplined.
Their first major conflict erupted on the Hungarian frontiers at the town of Semlin, or Melville.
The catalyst was the sight of several crusaders' bodies hanging at the gates of Semlin.
A sight that immediately ignited Peter's vengeance.
Despite the earlier violence committed by the vanguard, Peter gave the signal for war. The citizens of Semlin fled, but the crusaders pursued them relentlessly, resulting in the massacre of more than 4,000 inhabitants.
This horrific victory immediately alerted King Coleman of Hungary, who hastily assembled an army.
And Peter, who was fundamentally unable to command or organize his chaotic force, panicked. He fled quickly across the Morava River into Bulgarian territory to avoid the professional Hungarian troops.
Once in Bulgaria, the devastation continued, though they found Belgrade and the surrounding villages abandoned. Their populations had fled into the mountains.
The true disaster for Peter's army struck at Nicea.
After securing provisions, an unnecessary conflict erupted when roughly 100 German crusaders, who are referred to in some histories with the damning title of Children of Belial, set fire to 7 mills on the Nicea River.
This wanton destruction provoked the city's inhabitants. They rushed out, massacring the crusader rearguard and seizing an immense amount of material,
Including 2,000 carriages and many prisoners.
Peter returned, appealing for negotiation and religious sympathy. But the governor of Nicea rightly pointed out that the crusaders themselves had initiated the hostility.
At this refusal, Peter's dwindling authority just evaporated.
Completely. His own soldiers accused him of cowardice and faithlessness. 2,000 desperate men attempted to scale the city ramparts, leading to a general, utterly disordered fight where the crusader army was routed and cut to pieces.
The losses were just staggering. 30,000 combatants perished in that single chaotic battle, along with their women, children, camp equipage, and the army chest.
All the pooled funds and offerings, gone. Peter was reduced to a miserable fugitive, though 7,000 eventually rejoined him.
The research notes that this immense misfortune finally imposed a degree of moderation on the survivors.
It did. When Alexius I offered clemency, Peter reportedly wept with joy, and the remaining 30,000 survivors arrived in Thrace carrying palms, symbolizing a return to the spirit of simple pilgrimage.
The essential insight here is that, for the first time, Europe demonstrated that religious zeal without proper logistical support and military discipline is merely a recipe for mass suicide.
A brutal, though critical learning curve for the princely armies that would follow.
And yet, the fervor across Europe continued unabated. It produced fresh, equally reckless waves of people.
History details a secondary army under a priest of the Palatinate named Gottschalk, who gathered between 15,000 and 20,000 men in Germany.
Gottschalk's contingent arrived in Hungary during the critical summer harvest season.
And they immediately indulged in horrific license. Intemperance, pillage, violation, murder. These became the constant defining traces of their passage.
So King Coleman was again forced to mobilize troops, not to defend against Turks, but to chastise this lawlessness coming from fellow Christians.
The Hungarians dealt with Gottschalk's army through a clever and cynical stratagem.
Coleman's general feigned a desire for peace. He approached the Crusaders, who the histories describe as being simple and credulous, as brothers.
And persuaded them to disarm completely as a show of good faith.
And as soon as they were disarmed and rendered helpless,
The massacre began. The Hungarians ignored all pleas, all tears, and even the sacred sign of the cross worn by the disarmed men, slaughtering them mercilessly.
It just demonstrates the complete breakdown of trust and the extreme measures the host populations were willing to take to protect their territory.
Following Gottschalk came a troop even more destructive and morally repugnant. The army assembled on the banks of the Rhine and Moselle under the nominal leadership of a priest named Volkmar and a Count Emicio.
These men are often remembered as the Brigands of the Cross.
They operated under a terrifyingly simplified interpretation of the Crusade's spiritual promise. Their logic was simple and dangerous. Believing that taking the cross granted forgiveness for all sins, they felt completely entitled to pillage and commit crimes as they saw fit.
And their destructive energy wasn't even aimed at the far-off Saracens, but at the communities closest to hand.
Exactly. The leaders decided to persecute the Jews, claiming they were a more immediate internal enemy because they had crucified God.
This was fueled by intense religious hatred, certainly, but it was also profoundly motivated by the Jews' wealth.
Which was derived from commerce and gold, providing an immediate source of funding for the Crusaders who were mostly reduced to poverty.
The resulting massacres were described as pitiless, spreading fear and destruction through the cities of the Rhine and Moselle.
In their despair, many Jews chose a terrible self-destruction rather than fall into the hands of the Crusaders. Some perished in flames they themselves ignited in their houses.
Others weighted themselves with stones and plunged with their treasures into the Rhine or Moselle.
The records include these heartbreaking accounts of mothers stifling their own infants, choosing to send them to what they believed was the safety of Abraham's bosom rather than face the violence of the Christian mob.
It is worth pausing to note that amidst this carnage, certain members of the clergy did show profound humanity.
Yes, the research praises the bishops of Worms, Treves, Mayence, and Spiers for their enlightened zeal. They raised the voice of religion and humanity, opening their episcopal palaces as asylums and refuge for the persecuted Jewish communities.
Emicio's army, meanwhile, continued their march, laden with this ill-gotten booty. They were, in the eyes of contemporary historians, slaves to brutal superstition.
Preceding their battalions with a goat and a goose, to which they attributed divine status or some prophetic power, this unrestrained multitude marched onward toward Hungary.
When they reached Merseburg, they were denied provisions by the Hungarians. Feeling insulted and entitled, they attempted to treat the citizens as they had the Jews.
Merseburg, however, was situated strategically on the Leitha River and protected by marshes. Emicio's army spent a considerable amount of time cutting down a nearby forest and building a causeway to reach the walls, launching a full assault.
The assault failed catastrophically. As the ladders were raised, several collapsed under the weight of the men, dragging down fragments of the walls and parapets.
Panic instantly spread through the Crusader ranks, a panic that the historian William of Tyre attributed to divine punishment, famously noting that the impious man flies without being pursued.
The citizens of Merseburg capitalized on this sudden panic, leaving their ramparts to find the plain covered with fleeing, disarmed crusaders.
A vast number were slaughtered by the citizens or perished in the surrounding marshes, leading to the waters of the Danube and the Leitha running red with their blood.
A very small number of the remnants of Emicio's vanguard met a similar fate among the Bulgarians. Very few escaped the carnage.
Some returned home to face the scorn and jeers of their communities, while a very small number eventually reached Constantinople.
And there, the Greeks, seeing yet more Latin disasters, reportedly rejoiced.
This marked the unhappy conclusion of the early waves, leaving a trail of death, disorder, and the loss of some 300,000 individuals, having achieved nothing but the destruction of Christian communities and the slaughter of Jews.
So, having clearly established the disaster that reckless zealotry caused, the stage is now set for the professional soldiers. Let us see how the arrival of the disciplined armies, led by princes, fundamentally shifted the entire dynamic, especially in their interactions with Constantinople.
Well, even before the princes arrived, the remnants of Peter and Walter's forces, once assembled at Constantinople and augmented by new arrivals, Pisans, Venetians, Genoese, still amounted to about 100,000 combatants.
And the misery that had temporarily enforced discipline vanished instantly when they encountered the abundance and the riches of Constantinople.
License and insubordination returned swiftly. This led to the pillaging of houses, palaces, and even churches in the Byzantine suburbs.
Emperor Alexius I's immediate priority was pragmatic and simple: to rid his capital of these destructive guests.
He immediately furnished vessels and transported the entire mass across the Bosphorus into Bithynia.
Once across, the chaos continued unabated. They considered everyone they met to be an enemy and ended up inflicting more harm on the Greek subjects of the empire than on the distant Turks.
An internal discord quickly resumed, fueled by quarrels over the partition of spoil. The French, known for their assuming and bantering character, claimed all the successes and treated the Germans and Italians with visible contempt.
This sheer arrogance caused a separation. The Germans and Italians broke off under a chief named Rinaldo.
Rinaldo's attempt at independent action ended in swift and total disaster. His troop attacked a fort near Nicea, where they were routed by the waiting Turkish forces.
Rinaldo himself, along with some of his soldiers, survived only by converting to the faith of Mohammed and taking a disgraceful oath to fight against the Christians.
A profound, immediate humiliation for the Crusader cause.
When news of this reached the main French troop, they became impatient for immediate vengeance. Walter, who commanded the main body, wisely advised prudence.
He argued that Rinaldo's men had fallen victim to their own recklessness, and they should not repeat the error.
But his authority had evaporated. The soldiers forced the order of departure from him by sheer violence.
They marched toward Nicaea in complete disorder, believing the Turks were in flight.
But the Sultan of Nicaea, Kilij Arslan, was prepared. He had concealed troops in a forest and waited for them in the plain at the foot of the mountain.
The Christians walked directly into an ambush. Walter, a man worthy of commanding better soldiers, fell, pierced by 7 arrows.
The carnage was nearly complete. With the exception of 3,000 men who managed to take refuge in a castle near the sea, the entire army perished in a single devastating battle.
All that remained was a confused heap of bones piled up in the plains of Nicaea, a deplorable and literal monument that served as a grim warning for the main armies that were now approaching.
This disastrous first wave had 2 critical, long-lasting consequences. First, it prejudiced the whole of Greece against the Crusade enterprise, confirming Alexius's worst fears that the Latins were nothing more than brigands and invaders.
And second, it taught the Turks a dangerous lesson. They learned to despise the arms of the Western Christians, believing them to be undisciplined rabble, a notion that would cost the Sultan dearly later on.
And Peter the Hermit, who had wisely returned to Constantinople before the final battle, was reduced from a prophet to an ordinary participant in the war he had begun.
He had entirely lost his authority. Nevertheless, Europe, despite the horrific loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, was not discouraged. The nobility resolved to profit from these deadly lessons.
And now we examine the forces that truly define the First Crusade, establishing a disciplined venture aimed at achieving military victory.
The most emblematic leader of this new era was Godfrey de Bouillon, the Duke of the Lower Lorraine, descended from Charlemagne.
His motivation was rooted in deep repentance. He had previously fought for the German emperor against the Holy See, even killing Rudolf de Renfield, the Duke of Swabia, in battle.
And to expiate these exploits against the church, he vowed to go to Jerusalem, not as a mere pilgrim, but as its liberator.
His character was widely regarded as exemplary. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as combining the bravery and virtues of a classical hero with the simplicity of a Cenobite.
He was known for being prudent, moderate, genuinely devoted, and liberal. The soldiers saw him as a father figure.
And the other princes frequently deferred to his wisdom, granting him an authority born entirely of his virtue rather than lineage or political maneuvering.
His commitment was not just spiritual but financial, which is perhaps the most telling aspect of his devotion.
He alienated his own domains to fund the expedition, selling the Principality of Stenai and his rights over the Duchy of Bouillon to the Bishop of Liège for a relatively small sum.
4,000 silver marks and 1 pound of gold. This act prompted one chronicler to observe cynically that while secular princes ruined themselves for the cause of Christ, the princes of the church enriched themselves by taking advantage of the holy fervor.
Godfrey commanded a significantly larger and critically more disciplined force, 80,000 foot soldiers and 10,000 horsemen.
And his moderation on the march through the Balkans was key to his success. Unlike Peter and Gottschalk, Godfrey's disciplined approach reestablished the honor of the Crusaders among the Hungarians and Bulgarians,
who had begun to forget the violence of the preceding armies and instead offered vows for the success of Godfrey's arms.
Meanwhile, the French kingdom was undergoing a quiet internal transformation due to the Crusade. The expedition occurred while King Philip I was excommunicated, and his actual power extended only slightly beyond Paris and Orleans.
The great vassals ruled the rest of France almost independently.
Therefore, the crusade fulfilled a critical, almost invisible political function. It effectively saved France from potential civil war by removing these great, powerful, and ambitious vassals.
The great historian of the age, William of Tyre, noted that the most wise saw this as an invisible destiny that uses men's passions to accomplish its designs.
And the research also notes that enthusiasm leading up to the French departure was amplified by celestial phenomena.
The populace witnessed a solar eclipse where the moon appeared the color of blood, followed by an unprecedented splendor in the sky.
Weeks later, the northern horizon was seen to be all on fire, which terrified the populace and redoubled the enthusiasm for taking the cross.
It speaks to the deeply superstitious nature of the 11th century mindset, where natural events were often interpreted as divine signs sanctioning the holy war.
The French leadership includes several colorful characters. First, Hugh the Great, Count of Vermandois, the king's brother. He was brave and ostentatious, motivated solely by the hope of glory.
But history judges him as lacking perseverance when faced with adversity.
Precisely. Then there was Robert Courthose, the Duke of Normandy and eldest son of William the Conqueror.
He was characterized by extreme profusion, levity, and financial poverty.
The depth of his need is clear. He had to pledge the entirety of his dukedom Normandy to his brother William Rufus for 10,000 silver marks just to fund his trip.
Which demonstrates that even for the highest nobility, equipping a large contingent was an enormous, potentially ruinous financial burden.
Robert of Flanders also joined, a man who acquired the formidable surname, the Lance and Sword of the Christians.
He successfully recruited his forces from a region already accustomed to civil wars and filled with pilgrimage tales. He, too, exhausted his father's immense treasuries for the expedition.
And finally, Stephen of Blois and Chartres, reputed to be the richest noble of his time, famous for boasting that he possessed as many castles as there were days in the year.
Unusually for the time, he was learned and eloquent, often serving as the strategic mind of the councils.
However, history paints him as often timid in battle and prone to struggling greatly with the physical fatigues of the long war.
The final major contingent came from the Normans of Italy and the Provençals, bringing some of the most politically ambitious figures into the mix.
This included Bohemond of Tarentum, son of the famous Robert Guiscard.
Bohemond was physically imposing, said to be a cubit taller than the tallest man and highly cunning. He was unscrupulous, viewing the crusade not as a path to Jerusalem, but as a clear opportunity to attack the Greek Empire.
With whom he had already been at war, he masterfully leveraged religious enthusiasm for his political ends.
He preached the crusade personally at the Siege of Amalfi, dramatically tearing his own coat of arms into strips to create crosses for his soldiers.
This immediate act of performative piety quickly raised a substantial army, 10,000 horse and 20,000 foot.
Closely associated with Bohemond was his relative Tancred, a warrior driven purely by piety, glory, and honor alone.
Tancred stands as a celebrated model of chivalry in the annals of the crusade, flexible only to virtue and occasionally to beauty, and utterly immune to the political and financial interests that drove many of his peers.
The Provençal forces marched under Raymond of St. Gilles, Count of Toulouse, a man known for his fierce, haughty, and inflexible temper, who was already renowned for fighting the Moors in Spain.
And he led an enormous contingent of 100,000 crusaders from Gascony, Languedoc, and surrounding regions.
Providing the essential spiritual and organizational authority for the entire expedition was Adhemar de Monteil, the bishop and apostolic legate.
He served as the spiritual chief, tasked with maintaining order and offering counsel. Notably, he frequently fought on the front lines, wearing his pontiff's armor, exhibiting both deep piety and undaunted valor.
With these disciplined, massive armies now on the march toward the east, Emperor Alexius I's relief at surviving the People's Crusade quickly turned to profound terror.
He compared these approaching forces, led by ambitious figures like Bohemond and Godfrey, to the sands of the sea. The research confirms he immediately regretted soliciting their aid.
Realizing he had invited a potentially larger invasion force than the Turks themselves,
Alexius's strategy evolved into a sophisticated program of manipulation and hostage diplomacy. When Hugh the Great, brother of the King of France, was shipwrecked and taken prisoner at Durazzo, Alexius hoped to use him as a valuable hostage.
to enforce obedience from the other Latin leaders before they reached his capital.
Godfrey de Bouillon reacted with characteristic force and decisiveness. Upon hearing of Hugh's captivity, he immediately ravaged Thrace for 8 days, treating the imperial lands as an enemy country.
Until Alexius, faced with this immediate threat, promised Hugh's release.
Hugh was eventually freed, but only after being forced to swear a solemn oath of fidelity to the emperor, setting an immediate precedent for Byzantine control.
This event clearly demonstrates that Alexius viewed the Crusaders as an invasion force, not as simple allies.
The atmosphere at Constantinople was toxic. It was defined by the deep Greek-Latin divide. The Latins were proud, arrogant, and constantly boasted of rescuing the empire from the Turks.
The Greeks, in turn, were contemptuous, placing their cultural glory in refinement and dismissing the barbarous courage of the Westerners.
The schism between the Roman and Constantinople churches intensified theological hatred. The Greeks even went so far as to refuse to consider Latin fighters who fell against the infidel as true martyrs.
It was into this fraught environment that Bohemond arrived. Landing at Durazzo and immediately sensing the extreme tension, he invited Godfrey to join him in seizing Constantinople itself.
Proposing they divide the immense spoils.
But Godfrey, ever the man of honor and oath, refused this highly profitable political scheme.
He firmly stated that he had taken up arms for the Holy Sepulchre, not to attack a Christian monarch, even one as suspicious and duplicitous as Alexius.
This was a critical moral and strategic choice, potentially saving the Byzantine Empire from immediate collapse.
Godfrey's subsequent submission established the necessary protocol. To ease Alexius's overwhelming fear, Godfrey accepted the emperor's son as a hostage, a pragmatic move to guarantee Alexius's good faith, and submitted, leading the Crusaders in swearing an oath of fealty.
The terms of this oath were vital to Alexius's strategic survival and would shape the political future of the campaign.
The Crusaders swore to return any conquered imperial cities to Alexius's direct control and to pay homage for any future principalities they established. Alexius, in turn, promised necessary aid, provisions, and to share the perils of the expedition.
The ceremony following the submission provided a great anecdote illustrating the profound cultural clash.
During a reception where Alexius received the homage of several princes, Count Robert of Paris advanced, and, in a breathtaking display of aristocratic arrogance, calmly sat down next to the emperor on the throne.
When an observer questioned this gross lack of respect, Robert replied, "Truly, this is a pleasant clown who is seated, whilst so many illustrious captains are standing."
When Alexius had this bravado explained, he responded with remarkable political prudence, merely asking Robert of Paris his rank.
Robert bragged of his French noble status and his unchallenged valor in Europe.
Alexius wisely deflected the bravado, advising him, "If you waited then without meeting enemies, you are now going where you will find enough to satisfy you. But do not put yourself either at the head or the tail of the army. Remain in the center."
That's a textbook example of Byzantine political deflection. He turned a grave insult into a backhanded military instruction.
Meanwhile, Bohemond, the master of political opportunism, was received with calculated magnificence. Upon seeing an apartment filled with treasure, he openly remarked, "There is here enough to conquer kingdoms with."
And Alexius, immediately recognizing the threat and the price of his temporary loyalty, ordered the entire treasure to be conveyed to Bohemond's tent instantly.
Bohemond then raised his demands, asking for the title of Grand Domestic, which was the supreme military command, essentially the fast track to becoming emperor.
Alexius, who had himself held that dignity and knew intimately that it was the road to the throne, had the courage and foresight to refuse this demand,
promising the office only for future proven services.
Raymond of the Loose was the final major prince to arrive and proved the most difficult for Alexius to manage. He initially refused to swear fealty,
stating he came to fight the infidel, not to seek a master. Alexius was forced to stoop to extreme flattery and extensive displays of his magnificent treasures to gain Raymond's uncertain and deeply reluctant submission.
Only one major leader remained entirely defiant, Tancred.
He refused to expose his virtue to the seductions of Byzantium, openly deplored the weakness of his companions who had sworn fealty, and quit Constantinople immediately, crossing the strait without taking any oath to the emperor.
He was motivated by his own high standard of honor, utterly unwilling to become a vassal of the Greek state.
Alexius, through a complex mixture of immense gifts, flattery, threats, and manipulation, achieved his core strategic goal. The leaders were neutralized, the necessary jealousy was successfully sown, and most critically, the massive armies were quickly transported across the Bosphorus.
To prevent them from seizing his capital, His policy had triumphed over the immediate threat the Latins posed.
The disciplined main armies, now finally in Asia Minor, immediately confronted the true power of the region. This was the vast Sultanate of Rome, governed by Sultan Kilij Arslan.
Whose name itself meant Sword of the Lion. His realm stretched from the Orontes River all the way to the Bosphorus.
The Turks were a formidable military force, dedicated solely to arms and animated by a zeal for religion and their long string of military victories.
The first major target for the combined Crusader force was Nicaea, the capital of Bithynia and the seat of the Turkish Empire. It was massively fortified.
Protected by high mountains, flanked on one side by Lake Ascanius, which offered a vital supply route, and defended by double walls and an impressive 370 towers.
Kilij Arslan was not fleeing. He gathered a powerful army of 100,000 men nearby, ready to defend his capital.
The Grand Army of the Crusaders, despite the horrific losses of the People's Crusade, was terrifyingly immense, numbering over 100,000 horse and 500,000 foot.
A concentration of manpower that likely exceeded the population of many great Western European cities. The camp was a true melting pot, housing 19 distinct nations.
There is a truly haunting detail recorded in the research regarding the preparations for the siege. Due to the severe lack of local wood or stone for building palisades, the Crusaders reportedly employed the bleached bones of the People's Crusaders,
The unburied victims of Walter and Peter.
to construct their fortifications. The historian Anna Komnena wrote that this grim act at once constructed a tomb for the dead and an abode for the living.
The Crusaders utilized sophisticated Roman-era siege technology. They brought forth massive galleries, wheeled siege towers, battering rams, and ballistas.
Which were machines used to throw heavy beams. They also deployed catapultas designed to throw fire and stone against the walls.
Their own personal weaponry included the hauberk and steel casques, but also the crossbow, a new and murderous weapon that was previously unknown to the Orientals.
Kilij Arslan attempted to break the siege early. He launched an immediate attack against the quarters of Godfrey and Raymond.
Though the Provençals briefly struggled under the weight of the assault, the unified forces of Godfrey, Tancred, and the Roberts quickly rallied and routed the Turks.
The Sultan immediately renewed the attack the following morning. This second engagement was long and fierce, with the Turks using their preferred tactical approach. Rapid maneuverability, firing overwhelming showers of arrows.
And avoiding the close melee the armored Franks favored.
The battle cost the Christians 2,000 lives, but the Turks lost 4,000 soldiers. The Crusaders then performed a grisly psychological maneuver.
1,000 Turkish heads were severed and sent to Alexius, while the remaining heads and bodies were cast into Nicaea, using the siege machines to demoralize the trapped garrison.
The siege tactics employed by the besieged garrison were equally audacious and ruthless. They used formidable counter-machines, sometimes employing iron hands or hooks to capture individual besiegers alive.
They would then strip the captured men, hang them naked on the ramparts for display, and finally launch the naked, mutilated bodies back into the Christian camp.
A profound attempt to break the morale of the besiegers.
The siege also saw a famous display of individual valor from Godfrey, a Saracen giant described as being immensely skilled and strong, openly defied the entire army from the ramparts of a tower.
Enduring hundreds of arrows aimed at him, Godfrey, attracted by the disturbance, seized a crossbow, aimed carefully, and shot the giant directly through the heart,
causing the enormous body to tumble into the ditch. This feat was met with massive acclamation and boosted the morale of the weary Crusaders.
Despite the Crusader efforts, Nicaea still held out, primarily because the lake protected its final supply route.
The decisive action came when that supply line was finally cut. Greek boats, provided by Alexius, were transported by land and launched onto Lake Ascanius, completing the encirclement.
With a principal tower undermined and collapsed, and the Sultan's wife and children captured trying to flee, the city lost all hope.
And here, Alexius demonstrated his ingrained suspicion and subversion once more. His agents, led by Britumetis, negotiated a direct surrender with the besieged,
specifically warning them of the inexorable vengeance of the Latins. Just as the Crusaders prepared for the final bloody assault, the standards of Alexius suddenly appeared on the ramparts,
signaling a Byzantine surrender and occupation.
The Latins were predictably furious. They had conquered the city at the price of their blood, only to be denied entry by the man who had sworn to be their ally.
This calculated betrayal renewed profound suspicion. Alexius attempted to smooth things over with substantial gifts, largesses, and praise for their bravery.
However, his subsequent actions showing great kindness toward his Turkish prisoners and granting freedom to the Sultan's family, only reinforced the Crusader belief that he was attempting to conciliate their enemies.
Following the siege, the army needed to push deeper into Asia Minor, a vast and unfamiliar land. They were worried about both provision and surprise attack.
Consequently, the massive unified army divided into two bodies for provisioning. One column under Godfrey and Raymond, the other commanded by Bohemond, Tancred, and Robert of Normandy.
This division, intended for efficiency, exposed them to extreme vulnerability.
Kilij Arslan, having suffered the loss of his capital, had not been idle. He gathered a new massive army of 200,000 men and was waiting. He sprung a brilliant ambush on Bohemond's column on June 30th in the valley of Gorgoni.
Bohemond acted fast to establish a defense. His camp was protected naturally by a river and a marsh, surrounded by a barrier of chariots.
The Turks, however, were masters of the hit-and-run maneuver, using their rapid light cavalry to fire relentless showers of arrows, deliberately targeting the Crusaders' horses to break their heavy armored ranks.
The Christian losses were catastrophic and swift. Robert of Paris fell, having watched 40 of his companions die. William, Tancred's brother, was pierced by arrows.
The Sultan personally led a flanking attack, crossing the river and successfully breaching the camp, massacring all who resisted. The only ones spared were the young and beautiful women destined for the seraglios.
Accounts shockingly describe the daughters and wives of the barons in a desperate effort to survive, decking themselves in their most beautiful vestments, hoping to soften the hearts of their attackers.
It is hard to fathom the psychological toll of that relentless battle. Bohemond eventually forced the Sultan back from the immediate camp.
Robert of Normandy rallied the remaining knights, snatching his white pennon embroidered with gold and rushing into the fray, crying, "It is the will of God."
But despite the renewed efforts, including women providing water to the exhausted soldiers, the Crusaders were surrounded, exhausted, and utterly despairing.
At this precise moment, salvation arrived. Bohemond's fast messengers had reached the main column.
Godfrey and Raymond appeared on the ridge of the mountains, followed by an immense sight, 50,000 fully armed horsemen.
The sight of their shields and swords reflecting the midday sun, accompanied by the blare of trumpets and drums, immediately terrified the infidel ranks.
The desperate surrounded Christians were instantly revived. The two halves of the army immediately formed a unified order of battle.
Bohemond, Tancred, and Robert of Normandy took the left wing. Godfrey and the Count of Flanders held the right, Raymond commanded the center, and Bishop Adhemar flanked the rear.
The full Christian army advanced, shouting their battle cry, "It is the will of God."
The Turks, positioned on the mountains, could not use their preferred maneuverability tactics. Raymond's frontal charge broke their ranks immediately.
Adhemar, having successfully flanked the mountains, attacked the Turkish rear, completing the disorder. The Turks fled, seeking safety in the rocks and woods, suffering immense loss.
The victory at Dorylaeum was decisive. 20,000 to 23,000 Turks were killed. The Christians, witnessing the dramatic timing of the victory, attributed it to a miracle.
Invoking St. George and St. Demetrius, whom they claimed were seen fighting in the Christian ranks. They captured immense plunder, magnificent tents, treasures, and animals, including camels, which were entirely unknown in the West.
However, the immediate consequences of this victory were terrible, shifting fervour from large-scale battles to a war against the environment.
Kilij Arslan, abandoning hope of direct battle, preceded the Crusaders, implementing a brutal scorched earth campaign across Phrygia, Cappadocia, and Pisidia.
The unified army soon faced profound misery. Famine and especially thirst quickly set in, exacerbated by the relentless march through what the ancients called burning Phrygia.
The accounts of thirst are horrifying. In the country of Soria, 500 men perished in a single day. Women gave premature birth in the open fields or rolled naked on the earth in desperate agony.
And then came the moment of fatal discovery. Dogs, which had wandered off in search of water, returned to the camp with moist sand on their paws.
Soldiers followed their track and discovered a river. The entire army rushed to it, drinking without any moderation or precaution after days of deprivation.
The sudden shock of the cold, rapid consumption killed over 300 men immediately, and many more fell seriously ill.
The army finally found rest at Antiochetta, a fertile city in Pisidia, which opened its gates to them. The fame of their recent victories caused many local cities to offer supplies and submission.
During this necessary period of rest, two chiefs recovered from near-fatal situations. Raymond of Toulouse fell dangerously ill and was laid upon ashes before a supposed miraculous cure was proclaimed.
And Godfrey, too, was severely wounded, defending a soldier from a large bear in a forest, forcing him to ride in a litter for a long period of convalescence.
The union that had secured the victory at Dorylaeum now fractured, highlighting the instability inherent in the Crusader command structure.
The first outbreak of serious discord, which threatened to extend to the entire army, involved Baldwin, Godfrey's brother, and Tancred, who had been sent scouting in the strategic province of Cilicia.
Tancred arrived first at the ancient city of Tarsus, and the Turks there promised to surrender to him. But when Baldwin arrived with a more numerous troop, he immediately claimed the city.
Baldwin responded by directing verbal abuse at Tancred and the entire race of Norman adventurers. Baldwin's superior numbers and explicit threats won the day. The inhabitants chose him as their master, and Tancred's flag was forcibly cast down from the ramparts.
The betrayal deepened swiftly. Baldwin refused to admit 300 crusaders sent by Bohemond into Tarsus, citing an oath that only his soldiers should enter.
Forced to sleep in the open field, these men were surprised and massacred by the Turks overnight.
Baldwin's own soldiers, enraged by the sight of their dead comrades and fearing Turkish reprisals, forced his hand. The massacre of the remaining Turks in Tarsus by his enraged troops swiftly followed.
The conflict continued at Malmistra, which Tancred had seized. Baldwin approached, and Tancred's soldiers, suspicious that their chief might show weakness again, demanded vengeance for the Tarsus insult.
A short, brutal battle erupted between the Christian factions, resulting in Tancred's defeat by Baldwin's larger force.
Fortunately, night brought a calm to the fighting. Driven by mutual regret for shedding Christian blood, the leaders agreed to peace, attributing the reconciliation to divine inspiration.
Baldwin, having faced criticism from his own brother Godfrey for his palpable avarice, met Pancratius, an Armenian prince who spoke of the rich, Christian-populated provinces beyond the Euphrates.
Baldwin, now a widower and free of ties, immediately resolved to leave the main army. He took only a small, dedicated detachment and set out before the main council could officially forbid him from leaving.
His initial conquests were rapid: Turfsel and Ravendel. He immediately drove away Pancratius, who had shared the same ambitious plans. Baldwin's victories preceded him, reaching the metropolis of Mesopotamia, Edessa.
Edessa was governed by a Greek prince, Theodore, who only maintained control by paying tribute to the Saracens. Theodore, fearing the local enthusiasm for Baldwin, invited the Crusader in as a protector.
Theodore, who was old and childless, sought to secure Baldwin's permanent support by adopting him as his son and successor. The ceremony was performed in the presence of the people.
Baldwin passed between the governor's shirt and his naked skin, a traditional Oriental custom symbolizing the transfer of familial and political loyalty.
Despite the adoption, fortune soon wavered. Baldwin took the field, but was routed by Emir Balduk near Samosata, losing 2,000 men. This military setback led immediately to mutual reproaches.
The people of Edessa, who had long disliked Theodore's oppressive taxation, quickly declared for Baldwin. Theodore retreated to the citadel. He ultimately capitulated, swearing upon the cross to retire to Melitene.
But the volatile mob, refusing to let him live, immediately erupted in a fresh sedition. They stormed the citadel, seized the aged governor, and violently precipitated him from the ramparts.
His body was then dragged through the streets of the city.
And Baldwin, crucially, made no effort to defend his adoptive father. He was immediately proclaimed liberator and master of Edessa, seated on a blood-stained throne.
He quickly consolidated his power, purchasing Samosata and marrying the niece of an Armenian prince, thus extending his authority across Mesopotamia.
Baldwin had entirely ceased pursuing Jerusalem, focusing instead on his new principality. This new state, the County of Edessa, served as the principal bulwark for Christian power in the East until the Second Crusade.
The essential insight here is that while many set out seeking spiritual salvation, others, like Baldwin, found lasting kingdoms, demonstrating that the ultimate success of the First Crusade was often driven as much by secular ambition as by pious vows.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.